Hello everyone, welcome to the APUSH Ultimate Review for Period 8. Period 8 spans from 1945 to 1980. It's pretty lengthy, so we're going to dive into it as soon as possible. Hope you guys learn a lot from this video as the AP test is approaching very soon. So you guys can look at my previous Ultimate Review videos for all the periods and you can learn the material a lot better. It's going to prepare you for a multitude of questions on the AP exam. So thank you guys for tuning in today, and what we're gonna do is really dive into the different aspects of the period, such as the foreign policies, foreign events, domestic issues such as civil rights, and a lot more. So if you guys want to keep looking at review slideshows, review videos, check out my website called thehistoryreview.com, where you can access everything easier, and there's a lot more help you can receive through our tutoring platform from students who previously got good scores on the AP tests. So again, thehistoryreview.com. So make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into period 8 of APUSH. Okay, so some of the big ideas in this period includes the US emerging as a global power after World War II, and it's going to create the Cold War, which is the rivalry between the Soviet Union. And the US is going to take a foreign policy called containment, and they're going to try to prevent communism as much as possible through economic, military, and political means. One example of this is the Marshall Plan, and it's an economic attempt to really suppress communism and promote capitalism in Europe. So in America, there's economic prosperity fueled by suburban growth, which is the process of moving to the suburbs, consumerism, and the baby boom. And the civil rights movement and Great Society programs expanded federal power in promoting social justice and welfare during this period. And some of the major foreign conflicts include the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and domestic tensions from the Second Red Scare and cultural changes. So that's a brief overview. We're going to dive a lot more into it right now. Okay, so post-World War II. So there's an economic boom in the United States as the industrial base remains intact after the war, and this production is going to transition to consumer goods, which is going to stimulate the economy. Alongside this, the GI Bill also provides veterans with an economic foundation, which further stimulates the economy by providing low-interest home loans and higher education. And there's also a baby boom from 1946 to 1964, and this is a massive birth rate increase which reshaped American society. And we're going to have suburbanization as well. As income really goes up, there's going to be a lot of shifting away from these industrial urban cities to suburbs, and it's encouraged by white flight from the cities. And we're going to see later in the civil rights era, in that movement, there's a lot of racial segregation in housing. And the Sunbelt migration is a population shift from the Northeast and Midwest to the South due to the defense industry jobs, which offer more economic stability and prosperity for a lot of these people immigrating in. And there's a consumer culture on the rise as car ownership expands. The interstate highway construction also began, and the rise of television reshaped entertainment and politics. So the early World War and containment. So containment was proposed by diplomat George Kennan, and the US should block Soviet expansion politically, militarily, and economically. So the first doctrine really imposed in the policy of containment was the Truman Doctrine in 1947, and it pledged US support to Greece and Turkey against communist pressure, and this was the major first containment action. And then secondly, in my opinion, the most important, we have the Marshall Plan, and it just provided a vast amount of economic reparations in Western Europe, over $13 billion, and this strengthened democratic governments against the communist influences of the Soviet Union. Also, we have the Berlin Crisis and airlift, and it's basically a Soviet blockade of West Berlin, and US and allies airlifted supplies for 11 months until blockade lifted. We're going to have the creation of NATO in 1949, and it's a military alliance pledging mutual defense against Soviet attack and communism. And then in retaliation against NATO, we're going to see the Warsaw Pact, which was a Soviet military alliance countering NATO. So the Korean War from 1950 to 1953. So the context you need for this war is that after World War II, Korea was split at the 38th parallel, where North Korea was backed by communism and South Korea was backed by capitalism. And this conflict is really gonna reinforce how capitalism and communism are fierce enemies and how countries are willing to go into proxy wars to, enforce their ideology. And so North Korean forces are going to invade the South in a surprise attack, and this is going to lead Truman to really declare war without really asking Congress. And eventually the Chinese intervene, and as UN troops neared the Yalu River, China entered the war with massive force, and they pushed the UN forces back to South Korea. And this basically resulted in a stalemate, and there was an armistice signed in July 1950, and this restored the boundary at 38th parallel, and there was no formal peace treaty signed. And the impact of this war in the Cold War scheme is that it was the first major US Cold War conflict, and it showed the willingness to use military force to contain communism. And that's going to be a continuous pattern throughout the Cold War and this period. So we're going to have the Cold War at home, which is domestically. So after World War II, the second Red Scare is going to occur, and people are going to be publicly fearful of communism infiltrating the US. We're going to see the HUAC, which is the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they investigated suspected communists, including the Hollywood 10, which is a famous case, who refused to testify. We're also going to have the Rosenberg trials, and it's Julian and Ethel Rosenberg, and they were executed for passing atomic secrets to Soviets. So we're going to see how the US and USSR nuclear programs are also going to cause a lot of conflict and suspicion across both countries, because they're both vying for supremacy and more power through their military. And we're going to also see McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy, and he used baseless accusations to target suspected communists, and it collapsed after his hearing. So the impact is careers are destroyed, climate of fear, limited free speech and dissent. Okay, so now we're gonna have Eisenhower and his entry in the Cold War from 1953 to 1961. So during this period, the US would respond to Soviet aggression with overwhelming nuclear force. And the domino theory is gonna really erupt, and it's the belief that communism would spread like falling dominoes in Asia. We're also gonna have Sputnik in 1957, and it was a Soviet satellite launch which spurred NASA creation and the science education funding domestically. Eisenhower also gives a warning called the military-industrial complex, and how industry and the military are greatly linked, and this is going to cause a lot of tension and conflict in the future, and that it's not really good for the overall future of the United States. And we're going to have the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Okay, now we're going to look at the civil rights movement and its early struggles. So the first case you must know for the AP test is the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. And they declared segregated schools unconstitutional, overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. We also have the Montgomery bus boycott, which was another conflict and civil rights movement. And it was sparked by Rosa Parks and led by MLK Jr., Martin Luther King. And it resulted in integrated buses for whites and blacks. We're also going to have the famous Little Rock 9, and it's where Eisenhower sent troops to enforce school integration in Arkansas. And eventually, after a lot of these conflicts and advocacy by civil rights movements, we're going to see the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and it sought to protect voting rights, but it was a weak enforcement, but in the end it was symbolical, and it showed the progression of the civil rights movement. Okay, now we're going to see the high point of the civil rights movement. So I'm not going to go too much into detail, but we're going to have leaders like Malcolm X and Black Panthers who promoted self-defense and racial pride. And some of the stuff you have to know is the March on Washington in 1963. It's where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the I Have a Dream speech, and it pressured Congress for reform. And eventually, in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, that reform was established, and it banned segregation in public places, and it prohibited job discrimination. We also have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It ended literacy tests and it gave federal oversight and voter registration. Now we're going to look at Kennedy and Johnson, two huge presidents in the Cold War and in society. So we're going to see the Bay of Pigs in 1961, and it was a failed CIA-backed invasion of Cuba to overthrow Castro and embarrass JFK. So we're continuously seeing over the Cold War that the US and Soviet Union are trying to, do secret operations, secret military strategies to really spread their influence around the world. We're also going to see the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Soviet missiles in Cuba were discovered, and it led to US blockade, and there was an eventual peaceful removal in exchange for US pledging not to invade Cuba. Okay, so under Johnson, we're going to see the Great Society. So this is a program like the New Deal. It just differs in a multitude of ways. So there's going to be a war on poverty. So in this era of American history, specifically like this decade, we're going to see a lot of economic downturns, and just overall society is begging for reforms. And Johnson, he establishes this in his program. And the first part is the war on poverty. It included Job Corps, Head Start programs, and food stamps. It also established the modern day Medicare and Medicaid and Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And it was a federal aid to schools. There was also a countercultural movement among the youth, and it rejected mainstream values being opposed, and it fueled opposition, and it was fueled by opposition to the Vietnam War and a desire for greater personal freedom. And the sexual revolution challenged traditional norms, aided by the availability of birth control. So there's a more, leftist change in society during the Cold War era, domestically, and yeah. Okay, now we're going to look at the Vietnam War escalating, and we're going to see in the Gulf of Tonkin incident that there was alleged attack on US ships, and the resolution gave LBJ war powers without formal declaration, and that led to Operation Rolling Thunder, which was sustained bombing of North Vietnam. And domestically, we're going to see an anti-war movement, and it's led by Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, draft card burnings, and campus protests. And that's pretty much it for the Vietnam War here. So we have Nixon in the Cold War. He established Vietnamization, which was a gradual withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. And in the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, it ended US combat, and South Vietnam fell in 1975. Now we're going to see Detente, and it was eased tensions with the USSR, and SALT I limited nuclear arms. SALT I was a strategic arms limitation treaty, that's the acronym, with the USSR, and it froze a number of certain nuclear weapons. So it basically established a capacity. Okay, we have the 1970s society and social movements. So we're going to see an expansion of civil rights. And in the Civil Rights Act of 1968, it banned housing discrimination. We also have the Chicano movement led by Cesar Chavez, and it led to the United Farm Workers, and they advocated for Latino labor rights. Also, AIM was the American Indian movement, and they occupied Alcatraz in 1969, and they protested at Wounded Knee. Also, we see a rise of LGBTQ rights, especially in the Stonewall riots, which sparked national gay rights activism. Roe v. Wade also legalized abortion nationwide, and the ARROW, which was the Equal Rights Amendment, was passed by Congress but failed ratification. Also, there's environmental movements, including the EPA being created in 1970, the Clean Air Act, and the Endangered Species Acts. And the Love Canal crisis was a toxic waste disaster, and it highlighted the environmental hazards and led to a lot of these movements. Okay, so here are some of the key vocabulary you need to know for this unit. I would highly recommend pausing and scanning through these. It's very good to just memorize these terms for the AP test. You might use them on, SAQs, DBQs for outside evidence, LEQs for your evidence. So it's really good to memorize this stuff. And then also we have key historical thinking skills. So this is just good to, place this period in a larger context and analyze how different things are changing over time, continuing over time, and cause and effect, comparison, and all that. So I highly recommend pausing and reading through this. So anyway, thank you guys for watching. I know we went over that pretty quick. It's a large unit. It's very important in the AP test. And I hope you guys enjoyed it. So I'll see you guys in the Period 9 APUSH Ultimate Review video. And I highly recommend reviewing constantly over these next few weeks to ensure you can get a good score on the AP test and you know as much content as possible. So thank you everyone. I'll see you in the next one.